I found a survey made by Gallup in 2019 that says that a third of U.S. employees strongly agree with the statement, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. And also, less than a quarter said they were expected to be innovative in their job, and only 1 in 5 felt their opinions matter at work. So I want to ask you a question. What percentage of your organization would agree with this statement? My work is my passion. I get to make meaningful business decisions. I feel directly accountable to customers. My team is small and super flexible. The success of this business depends critically on me. I measure progress in days and weeks, not months and quarters. Every day I have the chance to solve new, interesting problems. I have a significant financial stake in the success of this business. Honestly, few established companies offer recruits what they crave most: autonomy and financial upside. The best businesses operate under the assumption that most of the genius is found among the people doing the work. The best business focus on turning every employee into an entrepreneur, creating zero distance between employees and users, making the company a power node in an ever-expanding web-centric ecosystem. This is an episode that is going to blow your mind. Let's start. Hackers del Talento, el podcast que busca cambiar el juego por lo humano en Iberoamérica. Nuestra tercera temporada está enfocada en ti.
Luchar con determinación por lo que quieres en la vida, ¿no?
Entender por qué te levantás todos los días y vas a determinado lugar o te conectás para desarrollar una tarea. Entender el por qué.
Un equipo que sean coachables.
Una persona que no es capaz de hablar de sus fracasos, o peor, que considera que nunca tuvo fracasos o nunca tuvo fracasos, es una persona en la cual definitivamente no quiero invertir. Porque yo quiero invertir en personas que hayan fracasado muchas veces, porque quiere decir que aprendieron un montón.
Cree en tu talento, tus capacidades, para que seamos parte clave de una región más competitiva, inclusiva, equitativa y próspera, donde juntos pongamos a las personas en el centro del mundo del trabajo.
Nuestra responsabilidad es ayudar a líderes a que conecten su cabeza con su corazón.
Porque es imposible hacer algo o tomar acción sobre una situación o sobre un problema del cual uno no es consciente.
Esperamos que disfrutes esta tercera temporada, porque va a ser una fuente de inspiración, unión, colaboración, aprendizaje, debate para la comunidad interesada en el talento. A través de historias, hacks, reflexiones.
Yo me leo a mí mismo para que no se me olvide lo que yo que enseñaba. Sea fiel a eso que usted escribió y que reflexionó. Así.
A mí me han dado un par de consejos muy buenos, prácticos. Uno tiene que leer lo que escribe. Y hay otro que también es práctico, que no es tan filosófico, pero que también me ayudó mucho. Y es que a la gente hay que recibirla.
Y conversaciones con CEOs, líderes de talento humano, escritores, actores de cambio, vas a recibir múltiples ideas para evolucionar como persona, como líder y para que tu empresa sea mejor.
Soñar y pensar en grande es exactamente igual que hacer soñar y pensar en pequeño.
Te invitamos a regalarte este espacio para ti, con conversaciones profundas y significativas que te harán pensar y te inspirarán a tomar acción. Únete a nosotros en este viaje para hackear el talento y juntos cambiemos el juego por lo humano, por un futuro fuera de serie. Our guest today is Michele Zanini, Italian, an expert in the field of human talent, and he wrote a book with Gary Hamel named Humanocracy. He's from Venice. Venice is a canvas where each corner narrates a story, each facade guards secrets of the past, and every reflection in the water invites contemplation. As an artist, Michele found an inexhaustible source of inspiration in Venice, a city that is more than a place but a living work of art. Our guest grew up and lived in Venice until the age of 11, which brings us to the why of this book, Humanocracy.
So the book in a way is the culmination of all the work we did together since 2009. And we wanted it to be, in a way, Gary wrote Future Management, where he set some of this stuff up, right? But, and he provides some interesting examples. But and of course, examples are important in our book as well. They feature very prominently. But we wanted the book to be more of a manifesto and kind of a guide, so a manifesto where we place this idea of making organizations more capable and debureaucratizing them, making it almost like a priority you can't ignore, right? Because it has an enormous amount of cost for individuals, for companies, and then for society, because at the end of the day, like, you're just it's just, the society is just the aggregation of all these organizations, by the way, public and private, right? So they all could be much better. And when the moment comes, by the way, they can be amazingly successful. Like, by the way, just a quick aside, Gary and I wrote again, this will be part of the book, of the new version. I wrote a piece recently, which I can send you the link to, on Operation Warp Speed, which is the initiative during the pandemic by the US government to accelerate the development and manufacture of vaccines. So they got the COVID-19 vaccine manufactured and delivered in 9 months, which is amazing. It saved millions of lives, right? And that was basically the government working very horizontally, ignoring all the bureaucratic bullshit, and partnering with companies very practically and doing amazing things. And so, the question is, we need to do that all the time. We don't need, we shouldn't only hope that this can happen if there's an existential crisis, right? So we wanted to, make that case, and that's what the first third of the book is all about. This, you can't ignore this. You have to fix it. Then the second part of the book is just to show what's possible. So we have examples from Haier, as I mentioned before, but also Nucor, which is a steel maker. And, the examples we chose them with some thought, because, it's often the examples that are held up of amazing companies are Google. By the way, I don't think Google's any longer amazing in terms of how it's managed. But, they would tell you Google, Spotify, whatever. But I think it's important to show there are really amazing stories of manager innovation, organizational innovation, and outperformance in all kinds of companies, industrial companies, agricultural companies, scientific organizations. So we provide, examples of that, and that's all work. A lot of that is research we did in the field. And then, so that's basically, so manifesto, then a little bit of a sense of this is possible. And then the other part is kind of a bit of a how-to, which, the book doesn't give us all the space in the world to get into all the details, but what we try to explain to people, read, or hopefully convince the reader, is that, you can start. I mean, if you're the CEO, you can start and have, you can do this organization-wide. But even if you're not the CEO, even if you're mid-level manager, or even a team leader, or maybe even an individual contributor, there are ways in which you can get a wave of organizational innovation started, right? And so that was the other big addition relative to prior work we had done. Just thinking about okay, how do you, assuming we've convinced you that this needs to change, the status quo needs to change, and the fact that there are interesting alternatives you can learn from, right? Then what do you do about it? How do you get from A to B? And so that's really the ambition for the book, right? Manifesto, kind of inspiration, and how to. And so, yeah, I mean, it felt like the natural thing to do, given all the work we had done and the learnings we had developed. We started it in 2014, so it took 6 years. It was kind of traumatic in many ways, but yeah, it's I'm glad we did it. And as I said, I can't wait for the new version to come out, hopefully later this year, which will be hopefully even stronger.
Moving on to the critical discussion at hand, let's talk about Italy. The dining tables is the heart of the family life, an altar where the daily offerings of land and sea are transformed by the hands of matriarchs and patriarchs into the feast that are both a tribute to the past and a celebration of the present. Meals are extensive, abundant, sprinkled with laughter, passionate arguments, and the inevitable mangia offer as much as an addict as with affection. The family roots extend both through time and space, connecting the living with the dead in a network of memories that are told in stories, both true and time embellished. The nonna, or men's, Annette while recounting tales of youth, or the Nono, who teaches a child to recognize the stars in the sky, are figures that perpetuate Italian culture and identify far beyond words, just like Italian culture and the power of unity.
Sure. I mean, it's also hard to generalize. You know, we're from the north of Italy, and every family is different. But I have to say that, you know, there was a lot of emphasis on connection and being together and, you know, sharing a lot of moments together. Certainly meals are sacrosanct. You know, sometimes in the US you see situations where, you know, everybody has their dinner at different times. And so that would never work with us. You know, meals and other moments were really important. Yeah, that's probably the thing that comes to mind as most prominent, Ricardo, in terms of, you know, growing up, that sort of very strong focus on the social aspect of being, you know, together. And then obviously the extended relatives, right, which, and I just remember these like endless meals, you know, at Easter or Christmas where, you know, there are like 30 people around the table and you were there from, you know, 1 p.m. to like 5 p.m., you know, which I remember would drive me crazy as a restless 10-year-old. But yeah, so those are some of the things I would, and I think you're right. Probably there's a lot of that also in your part of the world.
Michele graduated in Italy, then went on to continue his studies in England, and after that to the US. There, a professor inspired him to enter the world of organizational structures.
Yeah, well, so I was doing economics and business, but I gravitated very early on to organizational behavior, and there was one professor there who was really influential in making me understand, or inspiring me to see how powerful the way that organizations are structured, the way work is structured, the roles are designed, decisions are made, how that is a fundamental driver of both performance as an institution as well as individual kind of, you know, flourishing and well-being. And so that really got me thinking, even as an undergrad, you know, about this. Then I came to the United States, and I shifted a little bit in the sense that I came to study public policy. I was influenced by, you know, at the time there was these big corruption scandals in Italy in the public administration. So that got me inspired to do something, maybe to have an impact in some way. So I came to do that as an undergrad, and then I continued that I got a PhD, and I was a researcher in a public policy think tank called the RAND Corporation, and I was based in Santa Monica in California, which is very nice. But even there, you know, every time I could, I tried to do research that was kind of at the intersection of strategy and organization. So one of the projects I worked on, one of my earliest projects at RAND, was around the emergence of new terrorist groups that were a threat to the United States. And you know, one of the things that we were looking at is how the organizational structures of terrorist groups were evolving, in part because of information technology was enabling that evolution, and how they were moving away from kind of bureaucratic, top-down, very hierarchical command structures, you know, that were prevalent in the 70s and the 80s, to much looser networks that were much more decentralized, much more horizontal, and without a center of gravity. And so then, you know, there was a whole interesting thread around, you know, what are the implications for government, because governments are fighting these organizations, thinking that they're hierarchies, and they're not, and the governments themselves are operating in a very hierarchical way. So, you know, there's a mismatch. And so how do you make sure you have the right way to counter terrorism, and what is the organizational setup that would allow you to do that? So, you know, just one example of the kind of work I did there.
He spent several years at McKinsey before meeting Gary Hamel on a short project that also turned into a partnership spanning over 9 years and counting. This is where their focus and thoughts are now centered. And it's really interesting for you to start taking notes of what he thinks about humanization.
So I've been working with Gary since 2008, 2009. And what we try to do together is, a combination of things. They're all kind of under the banner of creating organizations that are fundamentally more capable, more daring, more resilient, more innovative, more inspiring, right? And that the idea is that most of them, there's a lot of demand for those kinds of capabilities, but most organizations aren't able to deliver them and develop them. And so, what do you need to do to change that? And our premise is that the biggest leverage point is being really innovative in how organizations are managed, how they're led, how they're structured, right? It's sort of management innovation organizational innovation is a really important driver of performance, as I mentioned earlier. And I think it's still very underrated. It's most companies and most executives don't really think about that very much, or they think in a very kind of incremental way. So that's basically, what we're trying to do: advance the practice of management, innovate the practice of management to create organizations that are more capable, more resilient, but also, more human, where people are able to flourish, right? So that's sort of our goal. And, we do research. We obviously write. We wrote the book. We're, by the way, doing a revision to the book, which hopefully will come out later this year. It's taking longer than we thought, just because there's a lot of stuff we're changing. But we're writing. We do, research in companies that are then providing some of the materials that we write about. But then we also do advisory work with companies that are really interested in doing something different. So not just like the same old kind of organizational change process, or implementing someone else's best practices, but rather inventing new practices, right? So we work with companies on how to do that.
What motivated him to think about the future of work?
Yeah. It was kind of similar in a way, Ricardo. Part of the problem is that we're having the same conversation about the future of work that we've been having for the last 50, 60 years. And the future is always 10 years away. It never comes. And so I think even at McKinsey, some of the work I was doing was around how do you make resource allocation and strategy a much more open, dynamic process, where you have more people working on it, more people generating insights, and then strategy is nothing more than a portfolio of initiatives that gets refreshed over time. So kind of a very emergent way of doing strategy. That was one interesting initiative. Another one was around creating markets inside of firms, right? So how do you create a market for talent? How do you create a market for capital and ideas? Most companies, operate much less like a market and more like a planned economy, more like the Soviet Union, right? Where, all the decisions are made at the top and they kind of cascade down. And so how do you change that? So those are some of the ideas, which I think are still very much kind of top of mind, or at least, budgeting processes. How do you make them much more flexible, right? So that you don't have to wait till the end of the year to make decisions that are different from what you planned. So there are all those kinds of issues which were very much, I think, at the leading edge of discussions when I was there, and I did some work, published some stuff around that. So there's definitely continuity between the work I did there. There's also more traditional work I had to do, for clients, but whenever I could develop new ideas, it would be in those kinds of arenas.
Why aren't we progressing further as organizations?
No, it's a very, very good question, right? Because in a way that's, I've been interrogating myself about why haven't we made more progress if this is such an, powerful lever. I think there are several reasons for that. One is that, in a way there are other ways, like the current system kind of works. It could work better, but it kind of works. So you're kind of satisficing to some extent. And beyond that, there are other levers which are easier to pull, more familiar to pull, if you want to juice up performance. So you could do M&A. right? You could just buy yourself. If you can't grow because you're not innovative, you can't grow organically, well, maybe you buy another company. That's how you grow, right? Or maybe, you talk to the regulators and you ask them, hey, can you put a tariff on these products that are coming to compete with me? Or maybe you got a break in the regulation so that you're protected in some way. So, consolidation is even financial engineering, where you're trying to juice up near-term results, maybe at the expense of the future, but who cares? Like, you're not going to be there when the performance stalls as a CEO. Like, your tenure is like 3, 4, 5 years, and maybe you can kind of have that kind of a run. So I think there's one set of explanations which has to do with, the system is not a total disaster. It could be better, but it's okay, and we can prop it up in other ways. So I think that's one. The second is, I do think that people don't really appreciate, even though they might say, people are our most important assets or whatever, they don't appreciate how feasible it is to have fundamentally different ways of solving a particular organizational issue, right? Because of course you still need to have direction setting. Of course you still need to have control of results. Of course you still need to have accountability. So, but the how you do that, how you get that control, how you get that performance can change radically. And I think most people are not aware of the fact that, it is even possible, like, to be fun, for instance, one of the companies we mentioned in the book has hired this appliance maker in China. They have about 60,000 people in China, and they have 2 layers of management between, the frontline person and the CEO, right? So is that even possible? Like, most people, their heads would explode, right, if they heard that. So that would be number two. Number two, like, they're not very familiar. Third, even if they were familiar and where you kind of convinced them that, it's a good idea maybe to change some of these things, they may not know how to do that. So there's a kind of a transition problem. And it's both, it's like, it's a practical transition problem, because, like, how the hell do you get to, like, 2 layers of management if you start with 12? And it's a totally legitimate point, right? So, and by the way, a lot of the costs might be in the near term, and a lot of the benefits might be kind of, backloaded. So there's a timing dimension to that. And then it's also a political problem, in the sense that, a lot of these models that we talk about that are more dynamic, that are less, top down and so on, they require fewer managers, fewer administrators, and they ask people who are in leadership positions to behave very, very differently. So, some people might say, why? Like, I don't want to change. This is good for me. It worked for me. I worked my butt off to get to where I am. Like, now I have to have other people make decisions. No, it's my perk, my responsibility. I earned it, right? So there are, like, a lot of behavioral, political reasons for why, these kinds of models are hard to come about. You need a CEO who's, like, incredibly committed to changing and who's really on it all the time for several years for you to get a meaningful transformation. One of the cases that we are going to be going deep in for the new version of the book is Roche Pharmaceuticals and Bill Anderson, who was the CEO. Now he's the CEO of Bayer. He's trying to do the same thing at Bayer. But we have, by the way, if you might want to link to this in the show notes, there's a really wonderful conversation with Gary, myself, and Bill on our YouTube channel called The New Human Movement. And he kind of unpacks a little bit the story he went through, like his own experience changing a really large and complicated organization. And I think the lesson is that you can make it work, and you can have impact and success. And you can also have success in the near term. You don't have to wait 5 years, but it will take you a long time. And it is a big, big commitment. Like, it's not something you can do, like, 2 hours a week, or, it has to be, a day, 2 days a week with your team, and drive and enabling others to change things. Anyway, we might want to get into that, Ricardo, if you want. But anyway, so those are very long-winded answer to your question. But I think it is a question to which there are many answers, right? And they all kind of, conspire to making this kind of a difficult thing.
Let's revisit the book and the discussion it has sparked.
in addition to helping organizations and individual people inside the organization adopt this kind of model, there are things we need to do at a more systemic level to promote this kind of thinking, these kinds of actions. We talked to some about this earlier, but there are these barriers to diffusion of organizational innovations, and some of them have to do with what's being taught in business schools. Some of it has to do with sort of the whole idea of leadership development and how that is structured. Some of it has to do with how consultants think about change and how they help clients, and they're models for change. That may not be right for these kinds of transformations, these kinds of transitions that we talk about in the book. There may be the accounting system in a way makes it difficult to understand the real cost of bureaucratic systems. We're very good in our accounting systems to talk about the inefficiency, the operational costs, right? But not so much about the cost of people being disengaged, or the cost of people not applying themselves at work, or the cost of missing a big opportunity because the CEO against everybody else said, no, we shouldn't do this, right? And so I'm also thinking about that, or human capital. I mean, you can think about that's doesn't appear it's only a cost item in the right in the P&L, right? It's not an asset in any way. So I think there are, I don't know, maybe you don't want to get into that, and that's fine. But I would, as you mentioned, what happened after the book or after it was launched, I really started thinking about these things because, as I mentioned to you earlier, as I think about the impact I might have, I don't think that comes from having another case study of another cool company, right? Because we have enough. I think we have enough cases to know this is possible. So the question is what can we do to accelerate this?
Let's grasp the name and rationale behind humanocracy, which stand in an stark contrast to bureaucracy.
Yeah, so we chose the name, which some people might think is a bit of a clunky name, but to kind of differentiate it from bureaucracy, right? And so maybe I can kind of start a little bit by talking about bureaucracy, because bureaucracy sounds like a old-fashioned term, a little bit like horsepower. It doesn't make sense. We're now moved much beyond that. But if you think about your audience, if they think about their own organization, I would say that most of the features of traditional bureaucracy still are in place. So power is invested in positions, authority kind of trickles down. It's that strategy set at the top, right? Big leaders appoint little leaders, right? People are slotted into very kind of formally defined and relatively rigid roles. Right, the rules and the compliance all comes from staff functions like finance, HR, and so on. And the way you have a career is you move up the chain of command, right? You can't. That's sort of how you make it in an organization, right? And your compensation depends primarily on where you sit on that totem, right? So those are the features of kind of bureaucracy. And what we're in a way, bureaucracy, you have to give bureaucracy its due, right? So the reason why we can have this amazing conversation on Zoom, and the fact that you don't necessarily want to, you don't have to grow your vegetables, and you can drive an inexpensive car, and you can have an amazing phone, is because bureaucracy has allowed us to get efficiency at scale, right? We're making semiconductors at the 3 nanometers scale, and Ricardo, that's basically the length at which your finger nail grows in 3 seconds. Right, so that's sort of the level of precision at which we're operating. So we need that. Right? So we need the precision, we need the stability, the control that bureaucracy has given us. But those things are not the only virtues in today's economy, right? We want organizations not only to be efficient, we want them to be flexible or innovative and rapid and so on, right? So, and the problem is that bureaucracy, it standardizes things too much, so that creates a bit of a kind of bias for the status quo. It kind of specializes people too much, so that makes it difficult to exploit opportunities that are across silos. It's too hierarchical, so the experience and the rank is overweighted over other skills, right? Other perspectives. There's a lot of focus on aligning resources, aligning people, aligning directions, and that creates very little scope for experimenting and trying new things. They're obviously quite disempowering, and they're all about predictability and control, and that makes it difficult to take risks. So basically, what humanocracy is kind of a bit of an alternative to that, right? So the idea is that what you want is an organization where the relationship between people and the organization is flipped. So in a bureaucracy, the person is the instrument the organization uses to get things done, right, and to produce results. In a humanocracy, as we like to define it, it's people that use the organization as the instrument to better their lives and the lives of the people that they serve, right? So this idea of like making the organization the tool and not the person the tool, it sounds a little like glib, but I mean that is fundamentally, like, if you look at these organizations that we feature in the book, they put the person at the center, and then the question is, how do we enable that person to maximize the contribution that he or she can have, as opposed to saying how do we maximize the conformance and the compliance, right, for the pursuit of efficiency. So that's the big difference. Humanocracy is all about maximizing human contribution for the sake of impact, and that's very different from a bureaucratic model where it's maximizing conformance and control, for the sake of efficiency. So that's basically, again, maybe apologize if it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think I can only define humanocracy in contrast with, the bureaucratic model that exists in most companies, in most large organizations today.
¿Alguna vez has sentido que puedes ser parte de algo más grande? En Hackers del Talento exploramos ideas y, sobre todo, trabajamos incansablemente por crear un camino hacia un mundo laboral más humano y próspero. Y lo sabes, tú eres parte crítica en esta misión. Imagina el efecto mariposa de compartir este episodio. Al pasar la voz a alguien que conoces, puede ser el catalizador de un cambio profundo en la vida de alguien más. Piensa en esa persona, alguien que como tú está listo para crecer y evolucionar. Compartir este episodio con ella no es solo un acto de generosidad, es un paso hacia la construcción de una comunidad más fuerte y unida. Únete a nosotros y sé parte de la vanguardia del cambio en el mundo laboral. Te puedes suscribir en LinkedIn buscando Hackers del Talento para descubrir diariamente aprendizajes del mundo del trabajo. Además, si ingresas a nuestra página web hackersdeltalento.com, te esperará nuestro newsletter Cartas al Talento, lleno de hacks y reflexiones semanales. Y recuerda, cada pequeña acción cuenta. Al unirte a nosotros, más que escuchar un podcast, estás activando un movimiento. Estás formando parte de una transformación global. Estamos aquí, listos para avanzar. Te quiero hacer una pregunta. ¿Te sumas a nuestra misión de transformar el mundo laboral en un lugar donde todos podemos prosperar? Pues bueno, continuemos juntos en este emocionante viaje y sigamos escuchando el episodio. Recuerda, tu presencia es el cambio.
What I found captivating about the book are the components, or the variables that define companies as humanocracies. In the episode description, we provide a link to the table showing what it means to be a company under the humanocracy model. Now, listen very carefully to the following part. Take out your notebook and jot down your thoughts.
And I should say, Ricardo, just for our audience, in case they haven't seen the table or they haven't really read the book, I mean, so humanocracy, I mean, we sketch out a set of elements that are common to a lot of these companies. So for instance, and I'll just mention a few. They all have, they're all really driven by a noble purpose and real stretch goals, right? So they have a mission that merits and elicits, deep commitment, right? So that's one big component. The other one is like, there's real direct accountability to customers. Everyone in a way is customer facing and accountable for real world impact. By the way, a humanocracy or humanocratic workplaces aren't necessarily always super warm and fuzzy where you get to do whatever you want, right? They can be actually fairly hard charging cultures, caring and very deeply caring of human beings, but places where they still drive you to perform, right? So direct accountability to clients, whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, to the extent that you can, all these organizations have as close as you can get, to a P&L at the lowest possible level of the organization. So you're really on the hook for managing a part of the business and not some sort of set of synthetic KPIs, right? There are branches. One of the banks we talk about in the book is Svenska Handelsbanken. The branches have a P&L, which is kind of, very rare. I'd put it that way in banking. It goes against the grain, but it's what really then motivates people to make the right decisions, because they can see what happens when they, based on their behaviors, and they have an incentive to maximize, business results, not just some sort of narrow metric. So that's number 3, like genuine P&L. Number 4, significant autonomy. The teams do have the ability to make operating decisions and take prudent risks. The 5th thing is disaggregated structures. All the units in a company are very small. They're basically a set of teams working together. Hire is probably the wildest example, but it's where they have about 4,000 micro businesses inside of their Chinese operation, which is their biggest. But this idea of disaggregating into small entrepreneurial units is true in many of these companies. There's also a lot of upside, so you're kind of on the hook to deliver results, and if you deliver disproportionate results, you get disproportionate benefits. The other thing that a lot of these places, what they do is they train people. Since you're asked to manage the business, you're trained in how to run the business. So, I was one of the companies I mentioned earlier, Nucor Steel. I've been to many of their plants in the southeast of the United States, and employees are trained on how to think about working capital, how to think about the cost of recruitment, retention, return on assets. I mean, they all know exactly how the business runs, and it's with that capacity that then they can make the right decisions. They all have very broad roles. So unlike a bureaucracy where you have very narrow roles, these are loosely defined, and it gives you ample opportunity for personal growth. One of the other companies we mentioned in the book is Buurtzorg. They're the largest home health services in the Netherlands, of about 11,000 nurses, and they're all working in these hundreds of these self-managing teams. And the nurses, in a typical or a nursing organization, you start as a frontline nurse, and then you become like a supervisor nurse, then you become a manager nurse. There's none of that. So the way they think about their career is a career of accomplishment, not advancement. So they just specialize in different areas, or they become mentors to others, right? But it's not about climbing the ladder. And the last thing that a lot of these companies do, even though they're all very disaggregated, they create lateral mechanisms so that there's a lot of coordination and learning that happens across the system. So that because it's easy to just disaggregate and let everybody do what they want, but that's not where the value lies. The reason you want to keep all those different units together is because the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So they have a set of mechanisms for doing that. And then the last thing that all these companies do is really are anti-bureaucracy. So they're always trying to remove layers, remove stupid processes. They have ways to roll all of that kind of craziness back. So that's sort of what humanocracies do. And now they're different. It's not one single system that you cut and paste. Every company does it. Every organization does it slightly differently, but you will find these attributes almost everywhere. So anyway, sorry, I thought maybe that might just be a helpful description of what exactly a humanocracy looks like. Now, when it comes to HR, HR could be a huge catalyst for these kinds of advancements in organizational practices and how people are, what kind of opportunities people have, right, to flourish at work. But they could also be the biggest break, right? They could also be the biggest obstacle. And so what my kind of pitch to HR leaders is to say, how do we stop talking about managing talent And how do we instead really focus on unleashing it? And again, we might be, you might say, oh, you're just playing with words, but I think it actually will lead you to very different conclusions if the goal isn't to, but because, by the way, what does the closest adjective to management is what? Like if I ask you, Ricardo, to manage is to what? How would you respond?
What would your response be? I believe that to manage is to create a vibrant work environment where each person can be the best version of themselves, achieving business sustainable outcomes.
But if you went to the typical person, because I know you're kind of enlightened, but I would imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that when people you ask them, give me a synonym for managing, they would probably say controlling. So the question is, like, maybe we should really stop about talking about managing talent, and then thinking about, like, if the goal is to unleash, what does that mean? Like, how does HR enable extraordinary accomplishment in the organization, right? And I think there are two main paths for doing that for HR. One is to maybe take the lead in revamping the kind of management structures and processes, the gears of the organization that are so out of date, right? So HR could be the catalyst for having an organization-wide conversation. The way we do performance management is broken. The way we do budgeting is broken. The way we do strategy is broken. Like, how do we use all our collective intelligence, our insights to fundamentally come up with better ways of doing these things? And so HR could become the organizational lab, like the R&D lab for the organization, right? So that's a huge opportunity, and I think very few HR departments are really doing that. But I think that'd be one thing. The other thing to think about, so one is kind of reimagine the management model. The other one is to reimagine the leadership model, right? So back to what you were saying, redefining what leadership means, right? And retooling mindsets and behavior, right? One of my favorite management gurus of all time is Mary Parkett Follett. And like 100 years ago, she said this, leadership is not defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power among those who are led. The most essential work of the leader is to create more leaders, right? And I think she was 100% right in the 1920s. And she's 100% right today. There's no other way to create a truly capable human-centered organization, right? So what you need to do as a leader is trade away the old currency of power, right? The perks, the decision rights, the sanctions you might be able to impose, right? For new kind of coinage, for wisdom, for generosity, for mentorship, right? And HR can and should be actively supporting managers in making this kind of transition, right? So that would be my kind of advice for HR. Aim high. Don't be content with taking the current playbooks on both the leadership and the organizational side, because they all kind of suck. Well, they're not fit for purpose, and try to dare and try to imagine something new, and create this kind of new path. And HR leaders that I've spoken to often complain about how they're not relevant in the C-suite, and I think this is their path to relevance, being the drivers of this kind of organizational innovation that I think is so sorely needed.
The year was 1984 in Qingdao, China, when Zhang Ruimin assumed leadership of a small refrigerator factory named Qingdao Refrigerator Company. On the brink of collapse and overwhelmed by debt and subpar products, Zhang was not destined to be a mere steward of decline. He was destined to be a revolutionary. Haier's foundational myth, encapsulating its commitment to quality, happened when Zhang, insisted by the low quality of the 400 refrigerators in stock, took a hammer and one by one destroyed the defective products in front of his employees. This symbolic act was not just a condemnation of mediocrity, but also a powerful declaration. Quality will be the linchpin of Hire's revival. Under Shank's guidance, Hire adopted the OEC management model, which concentrated on ensuring every aspect of the operation was executed each day in every aspect and by everyone involved. Quality and efficiency surged dramatically, enhancing Hire's reputation alongside. As China opened its door to the international market in the 1990s, Hire pursued an audacious global strategy. Shank grasped that to compete globally, Hire needed to understand and adapt to consumers' local needs. So, under his leadership, Hire acquired factories in Italy, Pakistan, and the United States, among others, adopting a 3/3 policy where 1/3 of the products were manufactured locally, 1/3 by global companies in the local market, and 1/3 directly for Hire. So the real innovation, however, came in the way they managed their company. Hire dismantled the traditional hierarchy and instead implemented internal microenterprises. Each of these units operate like a startup, with teams accountable for profits and losses, thereby incentivizing innovation and agility. This model shattered bureaucratic barriers and cultivated an entrepreneurial spirit and mindset, aligning employees interested with the company's objectives. Imagine this. So today, Hire is not just a leader in home appliances, but also a trailblazer in the Internet of Things, adapting its products to the digital age and focusing its strategy on smart home solutions. The company obviously has evolved into a global conglomerate, rebranded as Hire Smart Home, with a portfolio of brands under its umbrella, including GE appliances in the United States and Candy in Europe. So, Hire's story is an epic narrative of transformation and future-forward vision, and, of course, of humanocracy. And Michele has done an extensive research about that.
You know, it was very interesting. You know, I go to China. Well, I hadn't been there since the pandemic. My last trip was the day before they shut down Wuhan in 2020. So a lot has changed. You know, just on a very kind of maybe mundane level, it was amazing to see how many electric vehicles are there. Basically, 4 cars out of 10 is an electric vehicle. And the interesting thing is that maybe you see a Tesla once in a while, but most of them are like Chinese companies that some of them I kind of heard of, like BYD, but most of them are like completely foreign to me. And, you know, it's just amazing how that industry has developed. And I think we'll see some of those brands, conquer foreign markets in the near future. So it was that was an interesting thing. But, you know, I go to China primarily to do research at Hire, which is one of the most, I think, radically managed companies I've ever seen. They're the largest appliance maker in the world. And they also have pretty significant businesses in now biomedical, healthcare equipment. They're now getting into car distribution, especially used cars. So they're a very dynamic company. And, you know, they were the product of brainchild really of Jean Rubin, who is one of the most visionary management leaders I also have ever met. He basically took this company, which was like a really badly run municipal refrigerator company in the 1980s, and made it like the biggest appliance maker in the world. And, you know, his philosophy has always been to empower, the individual. He's a kind of philosopher, so he cites Immanuel Kant and the fact that, you know, people are not instruments, they're end in themselves, and therefore we need to do anything, you know, we need to create work environments where they can flourish and really be, maximize their own potential. I mean, he kind of talks like that, which is kind of very interesting. I don't think many CEOs really think that way, but he does. And so he's been on this mission, and, you know, and the company, as I said, is incredibly radically managed. I mean, they're successful, and, you know, it's a very complicated business. You know, just take the appliance business, you know, where there's all these functions that need to be integrated, design, manufacturing, sales, distribution, development, all that stuff. And despite the complexity of the business, he has a very simple management structure, which is very disaggregated. So just to think about the Chinese business, they have about 4,000 micro businesses that are brought together, and there are two layers of management between the CEO and the individual person, the individual contributor. So it's like, and in China it's about 60,000 people, so you can imagine a 60,000 person organization, two management layers, organizing 4,000 businesses. And the reason why this is not a chaotic environment, but actually a very efficient one and very dynamic, is that all these different businesses are brought together in kind of contracts with each other. So they have an internal market for resources. And they've been working on this for years, because you can imagine it's not easy to do. There are all sorts of problems with creating internal markets. How do you negotiate contracts with each other? How do you make sure that people are, the targets and the compensation that results from these contracts is set fairly and doesn't devolve into a lot of unhealthy competition? So, and if you want, we can get into some of that. But anyway, so they're constantly evolving their model. They're one of the few companies, again, who really think strategically about organization and the organizational design. And so they continually change the way they do things, which is why I have to go back to China every so often to learn, because we wrote about them in the book in 2020, but in 4 years, so many things have changed. So that was kind of interesting. And then, I also got to see some other firms in the area. I was in Qingdao, which is, a province, a big city of 10 million people on the coast between Beijing and Shanghai. But I got to see some other firms in the area. And as I was telling you before we recorded, one of the things that really jumped out at me, both at Hire and at other companies, is how they're all talking about how they're getting rid of a lot of managers and a lot of staff functions. They talk about managerial efficiency, and a lot of it is due to, automation and algorithms that really bring the information down to the level of the frontline worker. And with that information there, and with the tools and the autonomy to really make things, to improve things at the front line, you don't really need that many people in the middle, intermediating. And I thought that was very interesting, kind of contrast to the narrative that you sometimes hear, at least in the West and certainly in the US, which is how important the middle manager is, because in China, they're thinking, let's get rid of these people for better or for worse. And it's very, very different, very, very different kind of mantra than in the US. So anyway, very long, maybe answer to your question. Take it where you will, but those are just some reflections.
One of the significant quandaries in the world of talent is the role played by middle management, the median leaders.
Yeah, it's. I'll tell you a story. This is what Hire did about 20 years ago. They just got rid of forget the number. It was a crazy amount of middle managers, tens of thousands of people. And they said, look, we don't need this role anymore because, again, you used to do the intermediation. Now the intermediation is done peer-to-peer or through market mechanisms and so on. And so you have two choices. You can leave, or you can try to become an entrepreneur like everybody else, because we only have entrepreneurs, we don't have any managers. And that was kind of the narrative. And I think maybe half of them, made the switch and half of them left. In a way, you see this in the tech world. I think Facebook, Meta, recently, I think Zuckerberg made last year the year of efficiency. And there was a chart that I saw, which is amazing, that showed that there were 11 layers of management between Zuckerberg and a frontline engineer. We might have talked about this in the prior conversation. Forgive me if we did. But basically, he said this is insane. And so I think he got rid of some of those layers, and some of those, engineering managers became engineers. They went back to doing the work because there are too many of them. And to be honest, I find, a lot of people who end up being managers are actually happy to play other roles, and because we've created this crazy system in organizations where most of the time the only way you advance is by becoming a manager, right? It's why, if you think about it, in other fields, like medicine, professional fields like medicine, you're like a doctor. You don't become like a senior doctor or, executive vice president doctor. Like you're just a doctor. Yeah, and yet, of course, there is gradation, and some people become surgeons, and they get paid more. They're more specialized, but it's a craft, and you just become better at what you do. But you don't necessarily progress on a chain of a hierarchical chain. So, like, why have we created organizations where the only way you make more money or get more influence is by becoming an administrator or a manager? I mean, if you think about it for a second, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So some of that work goes away, and some of those people go somewhere else if they want to still play that role. But in many other cases, there's a conversion back to like actually doing, being in touch with the customer, doing real work in a way. Not that management is not real work, but you know what I mean? It's more directed to the customer as opposed to being something where you're just administering things.
I think this episode can be listened many times. You can take notes, go back, forward, especially when this Italian thinker answers what HR must do to transform the management and leadership model of their company into a humanocracy.
All right, so on the management model, so I think that is a big opportunity for HR to spearhead fundamental innovation in kind of management practices. If you think about, just take all the people processes that are underneath HR. Recruiting, workforce planning, org design, performance management, learning and development, compensation. Like how should these be rewired, right? How should these be reimagined in a way that unleashes talent, right? In a way that strengthens this kind of collective accomplishment. And we like to think of, you can almost think of a solution space. It might be hard to kind of do this without a visual, Ricardo, but I'm going to try. So if you think about some of the features of these kind of post-bureaucratic companies that we've talked about, a sense of genuine like P&L and accountability for results, for customers, greater autonomy, small units like the ones I mentioned earlier about hire, training and business skills, very broad roles, more transparency, more laterality. Like if those are, the elements of organizations that are really good at unleashing talent, like how might you think about changing the performance review process, changing the way the organization is structured, right? And so you almost need to kind of go and think about how do all these different people processes enable those kinds of features in our organization. It's like, what should we change, right? So for instance, take something like performance management, like which I think is a process that there's universal, I think, consensus that it sucks. I think people on the receiving end of performance management, think it sucks. Executive thinks it sucks, and HR people themselves are not happy. It's like everybody's dissatisfied. Yet we persist in kind of turning the crank. Yeah, maybe we switched from yearly feedback to like monthly check-ins. Fine, but it's like such a marginal change to a process that is fundamentally broken. And I don't have to kind of recite to you all the evidence that, it's not correlated with real performance. People think it's unfair, it's super time consuming, all that stuff, right? So like, how might you take a process that is clearly broken, like performance management, and think about, for instance, how do you inject customer accountability for customer performance? How do you reinforce, team versus individual dimension of performance? How do you, create really meaningful upside, for results? Like if you've done something amazing, you should get compensated for that, right? So anyway, so it's not an easy thing to do, to reimagine a process like performance management. But I think instead of just kind of fiddling at the margin, tweaking at the margin, I think HR could, inside of a company, perhaps even across companies, take the lead and say, how do we fix this? And how do we create a process that isn't just managing performance, but unleashing performance? How do we get more performance out of the process? And so, like, I think the role for HR is to be very systematic, take all the processes it runs, and rewire them with the help of the people on the receiving end of those processes, inspired by some of these other organizations that are doing it very differently, right? make a real progress there. So anyway, so that will be one, right? By the way, if you want, I can give you another example of a kind of a, I mean, Hire has its own very interesting way they manage performance, which is like through these contracts, right? So you commit to certain things, and your compensation, your review, your performance is judged on, have you delivered all these very clear targets, right? That you've laid out in your contract with another team. So for HR, they have HR units that get into contracts. So, and the contract might be, you're going to help recruit these number of people. You're going to help run training programs for these number of people. Did you do that or not? If you didn't, then you don't necessarily get paid, or you don't have a good performance record. If you do, then that's the case. And a super clear way to do it through contractual arrangements. Another example that is maybe a little bit on the far side, and a very different kind of mechanism, is W. Gore, where the way they do performance review is, peer-based. So, basically, let's say, Ricardo, you work with 10 different people at Gore over the last year. You indicate them on your list of exposure, people that have kind of been exposed to your work. And then those people are asked, like, how did Ricardo do? And the way they do this is very interesting. So let's say I've worked with you, right? And I'm asked the question, how did Ricardo do? It's not just some sort of like abstract question, or even one where I need to go through a multidimensional kind of matrix of competencies or anything like that. It's more like, let's say I work with Ricardo, but I've also worked with Antonio, and I've also worked with Maria. I will be asked at Gore, who added more value to the company this year? Was it Ricardo or Maria? And let's say I choose Maria. Sorry, Ricardo. And I just kind of go through this as a rater with all the people that I worked for, and it's like pairwise comparisons, like who actually added more value. And then you get this kind of natural hierarchy of contribution, because you get rated by 10 people, I get to rate 10 people, and we kind of in a way work out our biases, and we get a fairly good estimate of who's added more value in the company. And then there's calibration that happens functionally, geographically, so it's not just completely like, they take the straw output and run with it, but it's pretty, it's certainly the biggest driver of what determines compensation. And so, again, I don't know if this works for most companies, but it works for Gore. And what it does is that it makes everybody, really think about their peers and how to add value and be very collaborative. And it takes away the politics, right? Because, most companies, it's your boss that does the performance review. And so, like, you're going to try everything to please your boss, because, he or she has the deciding, authority. But in the case of Gore, there's no such person. It's everybody who's rating you, right? Anyway, so all I'm saying is HR should be thinking about these kind of, be inspired by these kind of very different way of managing performance. But you could take this concept and apply it to all that other HR processes, recruitment, whatever, and really be bold. And try things out the way Hire tries things out, and run experiments, maybe in a part of the company, see if it works, and then scale it. So anyway, so that's to me what HR should be, the kind of the home of organizational R&D, right? So that's one big piece. So let me stop here before we go to the leadership piece. But that would be one big wish that I would have for HR. In terms of what they do.
Hire has a formula for success, prompting reflection on whether this is achievable in your company, and if not, how are you going to compete with those who can?
I'll tell you how Hire does it. So when they set a target for almost anything, they try to set outside-in targets. So basically, let's say you are responsible for making a 3-door refrigerator in a particular segment, mid income customers, middle class customers, so not super high end. Hire has, a very good sense of how that segment in the market is growing. So your target is typically a multiple of the market, right? So, and they have different targets. They have basically a baseline target, which is like, okay, you grow as fast as the market. They have an intermediate target, which is sort of like maybe 2-3x the growth. And then there's like another target, which is like maybe 5x the growth. So they have like an outside-in targets, which is really hard to play politics with, because you're basically saying our expectation is that you need to do better than this benchmark. And the benchmark is sort of the market, right? So they do a lot of that. Or, they have like years and years of information on, margin, typical margin for a particular product. And they say, okay, that's kind of the baseline. And if you do this, you get paid this much. If you are way above that because you found a way to be more efficient or whatever, you get paid more. So they have a very, very kind of objective way of setting targets. Another example, and this comes from Nucor, which we might have spoken about in the last conversation. They're like a steel maker in the U.S. They're the largest steel maker in the U.S. And production teams, they're just basically shipping steel. It's so different teams have different targets. But let's take, one that is basically the melting scrap metal and turning into steel. There's, again, a fairly objective threshold of production capacity. So the engineers might say, this machine or this set of machines makes 100 tons of steel a week, right? So you're basically, if you produce as a team 100 tons of steel, this is your compensation. It's like base compensation, right? If you produce more than that, you get a production bonus. And it's like a weekly production bonus. So it's very, very kind of rapid feedback. And there's no cap to that. The more you produce, the more money you make. So you can imagine what that does is that so there's no target beyond this kind of threshold, but the team is motivated to sweat the assets as much as possible and find every single, kind of way in which they can get more out of the machine. Like they come up with a new process, they kind of automate specific parts of it, they tinker consistently. And so it's not unusual for a team with, to blow way beyond the rated capacity of the equipment because, they get paid for it. So there's no real target beyond like this base target, but there's a lot of incentive in the system to motivate people to achieve way more than the base. So, there are different ways to do this. And so I think often it's in both of these examples, which are wildly different, right? And in a way, that's the nice thing about it, because there's no single answer. But in both cases, what they do not do is have a bunch of like synthetic KPIs that mean nothing and which could be gamed, right? And which can be, and that cascade precisely down in the organization, because that's a recipe for the kind of dysfunction you mentioned, like both top down and bottom up. It's like impossible to disaggregate success in all these like KPIs and then reaggregate it up. And so what you want is probably more true, more real kind of targets that are based on either the physics like of the equipment or the reality, of the market, or a combination of those two.
A final thought for people leaders, for HR leaders.
And I think HR has tremendous potential in playing this kind of enabling role in organizations, both, as I said, on the organizational side and structure, processes and the like, as well as on the leadership side. But I think it does need to kind of, in a way, think much more boldly and much more big than it is right now. I think like many other functions in business and management, I think HR people, HR functions suffer from ADD. And that's ambition deficit disorder. We're just not thinking in ways that are commensurate with the scale of the challenge, right? And I think if we overcome that, and if we are not afraid of trying, and maybe not always succeeding, but consistently trying, experimenting, breaking new ground, I think HR can, as I say, and I don't think it's healthy for finance. Despite all my, good friends in the finance function, I don't think it's healthy for finance to have far more influence in the organization than HR. I don't think so. But I think it's kind of a challenge that, we need to take up as HR professionals. And I hope people listening to this, will maybe draw some inspiration and try this out and try some of these things out in their organization.
Michele, leave us with numerous insights to ponder and transform the future of human talent. This is my 3 fundamental hacks. 1, The fast-growing companies of the future will be modeled in humanocracy. 2. Let's strive to grow more, impact more, and amplify our ambition in human talent. And 3. Let's rethink work and organizational models. Sigan escuchando Hackers del Talento y pongamos en el centro al ser humano.